My mom and dad were communists when I was born, and I became a communist too, of course. They were revolutionary Trotskyists, and I was born and raised in the very left-wing city of Berkeley, California in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. I imbibed all of what the left had to offer, and I was a soldier in the cause. Then, in college and then in graduate school and later as a professor, I became a scholar of the American left. The history of the American left became one of my specialties, and I taught about it for about 25 years. I've never taught, until now, a course on the history of the American left. Renegade University is proud to present a history of the American left taught by me. It's going to be a 4-part webinar beginning in late August. And here's the thing. We have a deal on this. Until August 2nd, that course will only be 2 credits. After that, it'll rise to 3 credits. So jump on this now. Go to renegadeuniversity.com/courses to check out more information on this and to get your tickets now. I hope to see you in class. Thanks to ZocDoc for supporting Unregistered. With ZocDoc, you can search for local doctors who accept your insurance, read verified patient reviews, and book an appointment either in person or via video chat. So go to ZocDoc.com/renegade and download the ZocDoc app to sign up for free and to book a top-rated doctor. This is the Unregistered podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. This is a show about ideas, people, and behaviors that are considered inappropriate, out of bounds, or beyond the pale. The things you're not supposed to talk about if you're a school teacher, a college professor, a businessman, a politician, a parent, a neighbor, or even a podcast host. These are the things you're not supposed to say or even think if you're a good liberal, a good conservative, or a good citizen. Each week, I'll interview a person who has something bad to say. They might be a journalist or a professor. They might be a porn star or a drug dealer. They might just be an ordinary person with an ordinary job who doesn't care about the rules of polite society. I'm not interested in breaking the rules just to be a troublemaker. I'm interested in people who break the rules of conventional thought and to expand the scope of what is possible to say in our society. I'm interested in people who make me think. Few countries on earth have been more important to American foreign policymakers than the Islamic Republic of Iran. My guest this week is one of the leading experts on U.S. Iran relations, and he argues that if we don't understand that country, we are likely headed for war with it. This is my interview with Trita Parsi. I am joined from Washington, D.C. I can't say the name of the city because I dislike it so much. By the Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, my favorite think tank, which, you know, the name is a bit long. It's hard to get out, but the great Trita Parsi. I've been a fan of yours, as I told you, for quite a while. And in my view, and I think in the view of many others, you are not only the leading expert on U.S. Iran relations, but the best expert.
Appreciate that. Thank you so much.
People will soon see, if they don't know your work, they will very soon see what I'm talking about, because very few people, if anyone, brings the depth of, I think, the depth of knowledge and the sophistication of analysis, and from my point of view, just the right perspective on these issues. So thanks again for coming on the show.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So I told you I'd like to do this, if we can, in a particular way. I want to talk about what's going on with Iran in the United States right now, meaning like in the last 6 months to a year. And then I'd like to go back in time, do some history with you, since I'm a historian. And I just think that no one can really understand this conflict or this issue without, especially in this case, without going back to the history of it, because it's just so important here. So let's just talk about right now the latest news, which is there was an election in Iran, which most Americans won't even be aware of, much less the outcome of it. But why don't you, let's talk about what the election resulted in, what this means.
Yeah, I mean, the first point is perhaps, to what extent, we really can call it an election this
Right.
time around. I mean, elections in Iran have never been free or fair, but the degree to which the options that people could choose between being so limited as it was this time was somewhat unprecedented. You had a situation in which altogether 7 people were allowed to run for president, but only 2 were non-conservatives, and the 2 that were allowed to be on the ballot that were not conservatives were quite unknown figure, or at least not household names, certainly not particularly charismatic, really paving the way, designing this in such a way that Raisi, the person who ended up becoming president, Ebrahim Raisi, would have as easy of a job as possible to get the presidency. He ran against Rouhani 4 years ago and failed. Rouhani won 57% of the vote last time, so it was a pretty strong victory against Raisi. And Raisi has actually never, ever won an election until the one he just won 2 or so weeks ago. And I think that tells you something. And that one he only won because of a large degree of manipulation in the election. So what does this mean? Well, first of all, it means that now the hardliners, the conservatives in Iran, control the judiciary. They control the parliament because there was parliamentary elections about 2 years ago. And there too, almost no reformists were allowed to run, including people who were sitting parliamentarians, were suddenly not deemed sufficiently loyal to the system to be able to run again. So they control the parliament, the presidency, judiciary, and of course, the supreme leader of Iran himself is a conservative hardliner. All of this seems to be designed to pave the way for Raisi to become the next supreme leader, having the control of all of these different levels, institutions of power in the hands of hardliners. Now, this is an individual who's made his career in the judiciary. All of the advances he has gotten appear to have been achieved by being loyal to the current supreme leader. Getting the presidency certainly seems to have been as a result of being loyal to the supreme leader. And it tells us again a pattern that we've seen before. Hardliners do not tend to win national elections unless there either is some cheating taking place, or if the population at large refuse to go and cast their ballots. And oftentimes it's a combination of the two. And that's exactly what happened this time around. You had one of the lowest levels, actually the lowest recorded participation rates since the 1990s.
Wow.
About 47 or so percent of eligible voters participated. But if you actually discount the invalid votes, because a lot of people, a record number, participation rate would actually go down to 42%. But now the hardliners are in complete control, more or less. Doesn't mean that other elements of society are, vanished or anything like that, but they are not inside the power structure in the same way that they were before. And that's going to have implications for the United States in many different ways. But before I go into the implications for the United States, let's talk about the implications that the Iranians faced as a result of U.S. policy. Because had it not been for certain specific American policies, I'm unconvinced that Raisi would have been able to become president, and that the hardliners would have been able to do the manipulation combined with the voter fatigue that we saw bring him to power. The sanctions and the reintroduction, or the Trump's exit out of the nuclear deal, we cannot underestimate the deep, deep impact that has had on Iran. At a first level, simply for the fact that in this 40-year enmity between the US and Iran, we've never actually had an agreement, a written, signed agreement that one side betrayed. We have many examples of either the Iranians missing an opportunity because the US side was reaching out, but the Iranians weren't responding, they weren't ready. Or we have examples of the Iranians doing something, some form of outreach, trying to mend fences, but the US side was not ready. We have plenty of those cases. We have even cases in which the two sides collaborated, tactically at least, but then nevertheless, they went back into their old patterns, and either side or both sides felt that they got burnt by that collaboration. but we've never had an actual agreement that took 2.5 years of negotiations in which the US participated, or more than 12 years if you look at the nuclear negotiations as a whole. Mm-hmm. And then after having that agreement, having one side, in this case, the US side, pull out of it. This is the only time that has happened. And it's really critical because it vindicated hardline arguments that the United States cannot be trusted. And as a result, what's the validity and utility of diplomacy if the United States is inevitably going to betray the agreement anyways? So for those inside of Iran who already were of that belief, they felt vindicated. But the big difference is this. A lot of people who were absolutely not convinced by that and who believed that diplomacy could work, who did not believe this rather cartoonish idea that the hardliners had of the United States, which essentially said it would be inevitable that it would betray it, have now felt that there may have been an era of validity and vindication of that hardline narrative about the United States. But here's the real problem. The hardliners in Iran, since Trump pulled out, have been campaigning hard on this idea that this is not just Trump's fault. This is Rouhani, the centrists, and the reformists' fault. Because what they've been telling the Iranian people, as they are now suffering tremendously, let me just give you some statistics. The Iranian middle class, which is the backbone of the reform movement, was roughly 45% of the population in 2017, 2018. As a result of Trump pulling out of the agreement, it has now shrunk to 30% of the population. 10 million Iranians went into poverty as a result of these sanctions. Yeah. We're talking about a contraction of the economy over 2 years of 12%. We're not talking about growth levels slowing down. We're talking about a contraction, massive unemployment. And of course, the Iranian government owned mismanagement and corruption, certainly corruption, which has been rampant, made everything worse. But there's been corruption in Iran for 40 years. There's been mismanagement for Iran for way more than 40 years. The idea that you could have this type of economic crisis without that type of sanctions, we've just not seen before. So you can't really discount the value of the sanctions. Now, so the hardliners go to the population and they say, well, now look at you. You lost your job. You have no income. Look how much you're suffering. It's not just because Trump pulled out. It's because the reformists, the centrists, Rouhani, and all those people who promised that everything would be good if we just made a deal with the United States, they never had a plan B. They didn't have a plan B. They didn't have a plan C. So once the United States, again, inevitably pulled out in their view, because they put you at risk. Now, that argument may not have been sufficient to convince a large number of supporters of diplomacy or centrists or reformists to switch sides. But it certainly was enough to convince a lot of them to stay home, not just because they didn't feel that they had any options on the ballot, but because they had also lost hope and confidence in this idea that a lot of Iran's problems can be resolved if the Iranians just manage to find a way to come to some form of agreement with the United States and the West. So this idea of diplomacy with the West took a massive, massive hit. And these guys, the hardliners, campaigned on it. It was efficient. And let's take a look at the numbers. In 2017, Raisi got roughly 15.7 million votes. This time around, he got a little bit more than 18 million votes. So we're not talking about someone who actually managed to get a lot of more votes. Rouhani got 25 million votes back in 2017. So this is a guy who got roughly the same number of votes as he did last time, 4 years ago in the elections. The difference is that the reformists and the centrists who cast 25 million votes last time around, they cast about 2.5 million votes this time around. A massive drop. And they didn't switch to Raisi. They just stayed home. And they stayed home partly because there was so much manipulation in the elections. But a lot of people I spoke to say, even if the hardliners had not manipulated the ballot, these people would have stayed home anyways because they're just so disillusioned with what have happened.
Yeah.
Because they so strongly believe that Rouhani and diplomacy, etc., will work things out. And instead, Iran is now under more sanctions today than they were even before the JCPOA was signed.
So, okay, a lot there. Incredible statistics from about the sanctions. First of all, I just want to say, to me, sanctions are an act of war. Do you believe that?
I certainly believe that. And I think one thing that is really interesting, too, of our non-resident fellows, Aziz Rana and Ashley Ballard wrote a fantastic piece pointing out that when it comes to war, we actually have a lot of laws of what you can and cannot do, including, for instance, it's not permitted to go and bomb a civilian infrastructure in a war. However, with sanctions, there's no rules. And sanctions overwhelmingly hit civilian infrastructure or civilians. In fact, they do so far more than they actually hit the government. So in some ways, sanctions are worse and kill more people.
Yep, absolutely. So, okay, I want to get at the psychology, I guess, of the regime itself, the Iranian regime. So Rouhani, the previous leader, was considered to be a reformer. We could talk about what that means, right? What does it mean to be a reformer in Iran? But they seem to have made a change of mind, and you're saying that's largely due to the sanctions. But is it entirely because of the sanctions? So they've moved from what's called a reformist position to what's now called a hard line position. And I want to talk about what those things mean. These are words that everyone, including you, uses, right? What does that mean? What does a reformer mean in the Iranian context? And what does a hardliner mean too? And then it can't just be because of the sanctions, I would suppose, that they've decided to shift in this way. What is it that caused this other than the sanctions? And the big question, Trita, is what does this regime want? What does it want?
So let's take a step back.
Yeah.
In my analysis, I actually don't see a shift.
Okay.
The hardline base was there before. I mean, Raisi almost automatically gets 15 or so million votes because there is a very dedicated portion of the population that will vote in that direction. And I think that's also very important to keep in mind. I mean, we get this image in the West that, there's a small clique ruling the country and then there's everyone else and everyone else is against them. This regime does not have a majority support in my estimation, but it does have a very dedicated minority support that regardless of what type of a hardline candidate you put out there, they roughly get about 15 to 18 million votes all the time. So they're there and they have that support. It's not that people shifted that much. There's a small shift. It's the West who believe that resolving those tensions would be the pathway towards integrating Iran into the world economy and improving their economic life. They stayed home because they had lost faith in that path because of what happened in the last couple of years and because of the manipulation. And let me just add one thing. Rouhani got more votes in 2017 than he got in 2013. So it was very clear. He got the JCPOA, the economy was going the right direction. There were still some disappointments. People expected more because most of the growth that Iran experienced after the JCPOA was because they were selling oil, not because it was like massive investment coming into the country and there was more of a broad scale growth of their economy. It's just that was a huge influx of money because of the oil sales. So there was disappointment, but he still got more votes. So the votes go up and then they just absolutely crash down. And I think it's really difficult to explain that with anything else, or at a minimum, because the narrative in Washington was kind of odd. We've been sanctioning this country more than any other country in history, but that apparently doesn't have no impact on how the politics of that country developed. That's just bizarre. It's even more bizarre, in my view, how when Rouhani was elected, people in Washington and in Brussels, by the way, were very quick, without any evidence, to suggest sanctions got Rouhani elected. The sanctions that the West had imposed in Iran had made people so unhappy that they went and voted for Rouhani. Had it not been for sanctions, the population would have been happy to continue to have 4 more years of Ahmadinejad. There was no evidence for that. But taking credit for something good, that's something we're good at. but taking responsibility for something quite hostile, horrible, at least in my view, really bad development. Certainly, we're not going to take credit. We're even going to ignore that. So then, to your questions, what does it mean to be a hardliner? What does it mean to be a reformist? There's many different variables here that need to be taken into account. First of all, the reformists call themselves reformists, Eslah Talab in Persian, which means that they believe in the system, they believe in the revolution, but they believe that there needs to be reforms. The system needs to be changed. It needs to be much more open. They're not as hardline when it comes to social issues, for instance. Okay. They tend to believe much more in the idea that there needs to be some way to find a modus vivendi with the West. On the hardline side, you have more traditional people who are more socially conservative. Economically, at times it can be more protectionist. One of the critiques against Rouhani, for instance, from a lot of people on the left, is that actually Rouhani was really pushing for a lot of neoliberal policies economically in Iran. And even though the reformists tend to have a left leaning, that's not necessarily the case any longer on their economic platform. And the hardliners do tend to have a more deterministic view, or let me put it, a skeptical view of the West as a whole, in the sense that they do really view the United States as looking to destroy Iran's political system. They believe that they want to, based on history, that they have just an inherent hostility to Iran and to the Islamic Republic. And as a result, their willingness to take some risks when it comes to negotiations, I think, are far less than it is on the reformist side. It's only during when you have people like Rouhani there that there's been some agreements that have been signed. That may change now going forward. So what does this regime want? Well, look, this regime is no different from many other regimes on one fundamental sense, which is they want survival. And they put that ahead of a whole lot of other things, certainly the interest of the population as a whole. But is Iran, an anti-status quo state in the sense that they're trying to fundamentally change the order in the region? I think Iran, certainly as a revolutionary country in the 80s, was that. But come 1990s, you can see that the Iranians were certainly challenging American hegemony in the Middle East. But we did not any longer see that the Iranians were pursuing regime change in neighboring states in the manner that they had done in the 1980s. Okay. 1980s, the Iranians were the regime change country. They were trying to export their revolution, and they failed miserably. The only times they had some degree of success was in very weak states, such as in Lebanon. They succeeded in building movements that are now part of the Lebanese government, Hezbollah. But even that is hardly, it's difficult to see that having been successful had it not been for a whole host of other issues, such as the Lebanese state's inherent weakness, the invasion of Israel, of Lebanon in 1982, etc. But they tried in Iraq, they failed. They tried in Bahrain, they failed. Right. Come 1990s, they're shifting more towards the idea that they're going to make Iran's Islamic revolution so successful that it will become an inspiration to other states and others will seek to emulate it. That too has been a failure, but at least it's not been the same degree of, active regime change that we saw in the 1980s. But there is one fundamental geopolitical element that I think, regardless of what regime you have in Iran, is going to be a massive factor that no regime will be able to ignore. And that is that the Iranians see themselves, whether it's this regime or whether it's the Shah's regime, as a historic major power in the region. And as a result, they need to have a role and a political recognition in the region that they, for the last 40 years, clearly have not had because of their own radicalism, because of their own policies. They have been isolated and contained, treated as a pariah. And, there's much in their behavior that probably laws of geopolitics doesn't necessarily take that into account. When you have a country that size, that powerful, even if its behavior is highly problematic, if you seek to isolate it, it tends to make the problem worse. And that is exactly what has happened in the Iranian case. The more the United States has tried to isolate and exclude Iran from the legitimate avenues of economic and political influence in the region, the more the Iranians have pushed back and tried to make the policy of isolating Iran more costly for the United States. So it ends up becoming a vicious cycle. When they have tried to reach out and play a positive game, as they did in Afghanistan in 2001, they still got nothing for it. I mean, the Iranians were the ones who were essentially credited by the U.S. side itself for succeeding and bringing all the different warring parties in Afghanistan together and come to an agreement on a new constitution for Afghanistan in 2001.
I moved back to the Bay Area just 2 years ago after being away for about 25 years. So, of course, I needed to find a new doctor. And it was so hard, especially during the pandemic. It was so hard to find a doctor who took my insurance, who was in my area, and who was right for me. Thank God ZocDoc came along. This is exactly the healthcare service I have been looking for my entire life. You can search all the doctors in your area, putting in different parameters. You can find the doctor who takes your insurance, who is a specialist in what you need, and who is in your area. That's what I did. Just last week, I booked my first appointment with my new doctor through ZocDoc. You can do it instantly through their app. So go to ZocDoc.com/renegade, download their app, and start searching for a doctor for you. Now is the time to prioritize your health. Go to ZocDoc.com/renegade and download the ZocDoc app to sign up for free and to book a top-rated doctor right near you. Many are available as soon as today. That's ZocDoc.com/renegade. ZocDoc.com/renegade. Thank you.
They did that to a large extent to show the United States the strategic utility Iran can play in helping the United States to stabilize the region. And guess what they got for it 4 or 5 weeks later? They got included into the axis of evil. So then that had a profound impact on the Iranians. It meant that if you do positive things, you get nothing for it. That means that the United States is not receptive to positive measures. So then your only option left is, if you don't like the policy the US is pursuing against Iran, make that policy more costly. What does that mean? Do more of the bad things the United States doesn't like. And that has just been a vicious cycle. And the more the Iranians do that, the more difficult it becomes for the United States to shift its policy towards something that actually will be more effective, because a more effective policy would be more based on diplomacy and all of those kind of things, which means that it makes it more costly politically for the United States in Washington to shift.
Okay, this is a question I was going to ask you at the top. I should have asked you at the top. I'm going to ask you now, though. Why is Iran important? Because I think, in a sense, the argument you're making here suggests again that the United States really determines Iranian foreign policy. that Iranian foreign policy is a reaction to U.S. foreign policy. And if that's the case, then Iran is not important except as an object of American manipulation. What is it about Iran itself that is important from an American perspective? Why should Americans care? Why do you care?
So I think that's such an important question, because it's hardly ever asked. And I would go one step further, and I would say this: Iran is important to the extent that the Middle East is important.
Okay.
That the Middle East is important and Iran is not important. You cannot argue that the Middle East is not important, but suddenly Iran is important, right? So Iran is in the Middle East. It's a major country in the Middle East. So the question really is, why is the Middle East important to the United States? And is it? In our view, at the Quincy Institute, the United States actually only has two vital interests in the Middle East. One, because of the resources in the region, it is important for the United States that no hostile hegemon establishes hegemony in the Middle East and can control those resources because of the potential risk that it poses to the United States. And it also means that keeping the flow of trade, access to oil is also important. That, however, and this is a very important distinction, does not require or necessitate the United States itself having hegemony in the Middle East. The big difference.
Right.
Now, in Washington, the way our interests in the Middle East have tended to be defined are extremely expansive. It's everything from non-proliferation to counterterrorism to defending allies to protecting Israel to a whole set of different issues. Mm-hmm. And when you define interest that expansively, then almost anything is justified. Almost anything becomes a reason for the United States to use military force, particularly when it comes to defending allies. Defending allies essentially means we are just completely allowing allies, or oftentimes not even allies, strategic partners, to define what our interests are. They define our foreign policy. Why are we in Yemen? What is the national interest of the United States that is actually at risk in Yemen?
Right.
Well, we're only there because we are, for reasons that we need to have a completely different conversation, a strategic partner of Saudi Arabia. Mm-hmm. And because they're in that conflict, or they helped start that conflict, we have to support them.
Right.
So we are sacrificing our own interests, or we're defining our interests in such a way that our interest is Saudi Arabia's interest. This is part of the reason we're in such a mess in the Middle East. It's part of the reason why oftentimes when there are conflicts in the region, those conflicts are actually between two U.S. partners. Mm-hmm. Remember when the Turks attacked the Kurds in Syria? And there were all kinds of cries in Washington that now we have to protect the Kurds. The Kurds fought ISIS. They didn't fight ISIS for us, incidentally. They fought ISIS for themselves. It's not like as if they would have loved ISIS had it not been for their desire to be friends with the United States. Mm-hmm. But Turkey is actually a formal ally of the United States because it's a member of NATO. So now we're putting ourselves in a position in which our friends, for lack of a better word, are fighting each other. And what are we supposed to do? Be on both sides and just pour more weapons into both sides? I mean, it's just a bizarre situation. Mm-hmm. But if you define it much more narrowly and really put at the center of it the well-being and the interests of the United States, you do not end up coming with these type of expansive definitions. Non-proliferation, for instance, in what ways does hegemony in the Middle East prevent non-proliferation in the region? If you want to prevent proliferation of nuclear weapons in the Middle East, there's nothing that really says, oh, as a result of that, we need to have 19 bases and 50, 60 plus troops in the region. It certainly didn't deter the Iranians to pursue their nuclear program just because the United States had troops there. In fact, it may have actually fueled their desire to get to some sort of a breakout capability. Counterterrorism. Well, counterterrorism is valid, but doesn't necessitate hegemony. Doesn't necessitate to actually establish 19 bases in the region. We saw the president himself saying that in order to fight terrorism in Afghanistan, we don't need to have troops there. Exactly. We don't need to have troops anywhere in the Middle East to fight terrorism because our war on terrorism has been a disastrous war. We have actually killed more people than the terrorists have in the course of the last 20 years. And memos that keep on getting leaked from government reveal the same thing. The more we kill, the more we use drones, the more we bomb, the more we provide a recruiting tool for the terrorist organizations. That certainly has been the case with the use of drone warfare in Pakistan and Yemen. The data there is quite clear. So if we then go back and say, actually, our interests are quite limited there. This is not the same region as it was 40, 50 years ago where the oil was so important. We do not need to have it. In that scenario, Iran actually is not that particularly important, pursuing all kinds of policies that we've had in the past. I mean, the last years with Trump were truly astonishing, in which the Trump administration was so obsessed with Iran that they were willing to sacrifice almost all other interests of the United States just to get to the Iranians, which would make you think that, oh my God, Iran is the most important country in the world, in the most important region in the world. Absolutely not. It's just an absolute bizarre caricature, not a break of American foreign policy, but a caricature of American foreign policy, in which our understanding, our strategic priorities are just so erroneous and manipulated by all kinds of outside forces.
That was wonderfully clarifying. Thank you for that. So much to unpack. So you mentioned Yemen. So this is another recent news item related to Iran. President Joe Biden announced that he would be, what did he actually announce? What did he actually promise? To end the war in Yemen? To what? What did he actually promise?
He promised to, he said that, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. Yeah.
He promised that he said that the war should end. The promise that he did towards U.S. policy was more specifically saying that the United States would cease support for offensive measures by the Saudi military. Right. The key word there is offensive. How you define offensive can make that statement profound or meaningless. And so far, it seems to have tilted a little bit more towards a lack of meaning. Because, for instance, the blockade itself that the Saudis are imposing is an offensive weapon. It is a key factor as to why Yemenis are being starved to death. Again, an example of how blockades and broad-based sanctions kill more people than wars do at time and are completely indiscriminate. That's an offensive weapon. That is not a defensive weapon. And there are mechanisms that can be used, that the UN has at its disposal, that can ensure that weapons don't get into Yemen from Iran or elsewhere without imposing a blockade that starves the Yemeni people to death. And incidentally, there are indications that the Houthis actually are benefiting from the blockade as well, because this is what oftentimes happens. When you have blockades, those who have guns control what comes in and what goes out, control prices and everything else, and actually have enabled them to use it to their favor, which means to the detriment of the civilian population as a whole. We have not done enough in any way, shape, or form to pressure the Saudis to end the blockade. We can put a full stop to the Saudi military if we wanted to. We haven't. I think the administration is trying to walk some sort of a balancing act right now, because on the one hand, they want to be tougher on the Saudis, but they're afraid of pushing the Saudis too far away. I think it's gotten complicated as well because of the Abrams Accord and what the administration views as a positive development if the Saudis also joined the Abrams Accord, which I actually don't think would be a good thing. In my analysis, we had Steve Simon produce a great brief 2 weeks or so ago looking at the Abrams Accord and saying it actually has a destabilizing potential. Because if the Saudis and the Emiratis already signed the Abrams Accord, end up not just doing tourism and an exchange of embassies with Israel, but actually allows the Israelis to use Emirati bases, it dramatically lowers the bar for the Israelis to take military action against Iran.
Oh, wow.
Which, from a U.S. standpoint, we view as a very negative development, because such a war would almost inevitably drag the United States into that war.
Wow.
I mean, that's what Netanyahu wanted. He wanted the U.S. to go to war with Iran. And if the Israelis start that war, we always feared that we would get dragged into it. This was a key fear that the Obama administration had. And even Trump told the Israelis, you want that war, why don't you start it yourself? If you then have bases that the Israelis can use in the Emirates, the logistical challenges, the military problems the Israelis would have in launching that attack actually get much smaller, which makes it easier for the Israelis to go in that direction, makes it easier for them to drag us into war, which means that instead of leaving the Middle East, which is what the Biden administration says that he wants, which is what the Trump administration said that he wanted, we would actually get dragged back into it. And all of that for what? There's been a Saudi peace plan on the table since 2002, which is that the Arab world writ large would recognize Israel in return for an Israeli recognition of a Palestinian state. So there's logical pathways to that situation that actually would be stabilizing, would not be destabilizing. But we seem to be doing everything we can to avoid that.
Man, I love it when this happens. I just received earlier today a photo from an unregistered listener showing his box of Paloma Verde CBD products that he just ordered. And in that box came a handwritten note from Vanessa Abelar, one of the owners of Paloma Verde CBD. They take care of their customers. It's one of the many things I love about that company. They have been supporting Unregistered for more than a year now, and Unregistered listeners, our community, has been supporting them right back in kind because our bodies feel better having used Paloma Verde products. Again, get 25% off every single order in the Paloma Verde store. This is something you won't get from other CBD companies, which are mostly owned by corporate conglomerates. Paloma Verde is a family-owned, family-run business in San Antonio, Texas, run by Vanessa and her husband, Carlos Abelar. So go to palomaverdecbd.com, use the discount code RENEGADE, get that 25% deal, and also check out the Unregistered Combo Pack, which is my 3 favorite products, bundled together, and you get 33% off that. The Thad Pack, it's called by some people, includes their amazing, delicious, fruit-flavored gummies. These are the best tasting gummies I've ever had. That's including the ones with THC. 10 milligrams in each gummy, by the way. Now, their soft gels, this is like their serious medicine. There's 25 milligrams of CBD in every soft gel. I take several of these every day, depending on how my anxiety is doing. My favorite thing, though, that I've been talking about for more than a year now, is their fast-acting, high-potency tincture. You put a few drops under your tongue, and for me, the anxiety melts away, and it helps me beautifully with my sleep. So, again, go to palomaverdecbd.com. Use the discount code RENEGADE. Get that 25% off discount on everything. Get the 33% off the Unregistered Combo Pack, otherwise known as the Thad Pack. And I think your body will thank you, as do I. Thanks. A direct war between Israel and Iran? That's terrifying. And a lot of people have said recently, and I'm one of them, that such a war is likely to be a world war because we have these alliances, it seems, but tell me if I'm wrong about this. It seems to me over the last several years that 2 alliances have been formed in the Middle East, essentially. One led by the United States, and that's with Saudi Arabia and Israel, of course, an alliance there. And on the other side is Iran, Russia, and Syria. Does that make sense to talk about it that way? That there are 2 emerging alliances, which to me looks more and more like the beginning of World War I?
I think you're quite correct. It is very worrisome. Those alliances have already been there informally for some time. Formalizing it further, in my view, really does increase the likelihood of war because there's no clear balance between these 2 pacts. I mean, without the US's military finger on the scale will tilt very differently if you look at these alliances. So the Israeli, Emirati, Saudi side absolutely required the US to be part of this. And from the Quincy Administration Institute's perspective, we're very much looking at what's in the US interest. And if there are manipulations and efforts to constantly drag us back into the region, which is to our detriment, then we find that highly problematic. And it's also detrimental to the region as a whole, because we believe that if we are not a belligerent in so many of these different conflicts, which we unfortunately are, we're a belligerent in Yemen right now. We could instead be using our diplomatic influence to be able to help lead efforts to mediate, resolve some of these conflicts. But once we are the arms salesman, the political protector of one party or more in a conflict, then we have essentially disqualified ourselves from actually being able to play a constructive diplomatic role. And in our view, stability in the region is conducive to US interests precisely because it reduces the likelihood of conflicts that could potentially drag the US into it. We have the ability to play that role. We're not, because we have instead chosen to make ourselves belligerents in these conflicts. Again, going back to what I said earlier on, because we've defined our interests as such, we have to stand with allies. We have to help allies, which means that instead of being able to be a peacemaker, we are now party to various conflicts. By the way, we have a report coming out that I think you will find quite interesting. Matt Pett is the lead author on this report, took a look at all of the different interventions in the region for the last 10 years, just to see, is it really so, this Washington narrative that there's like one country in the region that is responsible for the instability in the region? It used to be Gaddafi, it was Iran, then it was Saddam Hussein, then it's back to Iran. This is a very common theme in Washington, which we reduce the complexity of the region to like there's one bad actor. Well, if the data would be correct, then Iran for the last 10 years would be like an outlier in terms of interventions that it's done in the region. Instead, we're seeing that there's 6 countries: Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, Turkey. Let me count again. Saudi Arabia, Iran, UAE, Israel, Qatar, and Turkey, who all have played a roughly equal role in terms of interventions. There's essentially 2 intervals. There's a top tier of Iran, Turkey, and the UAE that have been the most interventionist. Iran's interventionism has been pretty stable. Turkey and UAE have actually surpassed Iran in terms of military interventions in the affairs of other states. You have a lower tier with Qatar and Saudi Arabia, but they are the financiers of UAE's and Turkey. What's fascinating with all of this is that they're all, contributing to instability and interventions. The report is called No Clean Hands, because that is truly what the situation is there. But here's the potential flip side. Or first, there's a bad thing with it, but there's a flip side to that bad thing. 5 out of the 6 most interventionist, and by that, in our view, destabilizing actors in the region are armed and politically supported by the United States.
Right.
But that also means that 5 out of the 6, we actually have a lot of leverage. A lot of these instabilities in the region are actually because US allies are fighting each other. Take a look at Libya, for instance. You have the Turks and the Emiratis on 2 different sides. Well, the United States actually has leverage with these countries because of its strong relations with them, and could use its relationship with them to help resolve those conflicts. We're not, though, because we're so focused on Iran. And again, this obsession with Iran. So we're turning a complete blind eye so that we have completely destroyed Libya, and it's continuously being destroyed with the warfare that is taking place there, most of it driven by partners of the United States. And instead, we're just focusing on Iran. This is not to give the Iranians a free pass. On the contrary, it's very clear from the data. It's one of the most interventionist countries in the region. And it's been so steadily, whereas some of the others are more newcomers to this game. But it means that the lion's share is actually taking place outside of things that Iran is involved in. And we have an ability to address those issues and resolve it, but we're not, because we're just focusing on what the Iranians are doing. So there's a lot of low-hanging fruit in which the United States actually could be very helpful to bring about stability. But we're not doing that. And I think that's a shame, particularly if we want to make the claim that stability in the region is in our interest, and that's what is guiding our foreign policy. Well, if that's the case, there's a lot we can do.
Right. Now, back to Yemen, because, tremendous line of thought there. The speaking of countries that maybe shouldn't be important, but now are for very bad reasons, Yemen. The American hardliners on Iran, not just the Trump people, but there are many people in the foreign policy establishment who have a hardline position on Iran, will say to you and others like me, I suppose, that stopping the war against Yemen is empowering the Houthi rebels there, who are on the verge, I guess, of taking control of the entire country. You can talk to me about that too, and which would be an addition to the Shia Russian axis. This is the line of argument. This is the argument that's being made. You know this, right? That the Houthis are aligned with Iran, that Iran has supported them in various ways, and that as soon as they take control, as soon as the Houthis take control of Yemen, they're going to establish, again, another wing of this axis that I've been talking about, the Russia, Syria, Iran axis. And World War III will be right around the corner. And Yemen is not just around the corner from Saudi Arabia. It shares a border, very long border with Saudi Arabia. So we have, back-to-back enemies right there, potentially. Is this all bunk, Trita? Like the Houthis are not
I
aiming
think
to
it's
be
bunk
part of
for
that?
several different reasons.
Okay.
I think this is bunk for several different reasons. First of all, the relationship between the Houthis and the Iranians is not only a rather new one, it's a rather superficial one. The idea that they're Shia is not correct. They're a different offshoot. They don't identify themselves as such. They do not view the Iranian theocracy in any way, shape, or form as a guiding star or anything like that, which is unlike Hezbollah, for instance. And in fact, I remember I was interviewing an Iranian official in 2011, and he told me that he didn't know that the Houthis technically were a branch of Houthis until 2009 or so, which I thought was quite interesting because there's a report from Carnegie that also shows that the Saudi narrative on the Houthis was to never point out that they have any connection or an offshoot from Shiism until 2009, 2010. Then suddenly you could not ever say Houthi without saying the Shia movement Houthi. But that was not the language of the Saudis before that. And in fact, they were working closely with the Houthis in many instances and were allied with them.
Right.
So again, the idea that now we have this neat crusader religious war type of scenario in which we know who's on what side, etc. Right. Those are the simplifications. And we make a lot of bad decisions. That's one. The idea that the Russians in any way, shape, or form have aligned themselves with Shias in the region is nonsensical. The Russians have their own interests, and to their credit, they define their interests well and they pursue it with discipline. We do not. We really do not. They know, the Russians know what they want and they pursue it with discipline. We cannot even define what our interest in the region is in a way that is actually operational. Instead, we define it in such a way that we're just overextended and all over the place. So on that basis, all wrong. But then going back one step further, look, I don't think the Houthis are going to succeed in all of Yemen. They certainly have been quite successful on the battlefield, and it's partly because they've been pushing a narrative that the Saudis are a foreign invasion of Yemen and that it is a nationalist duty to be able to push back against the Saudis. If the Saudis and the US are essentially out, I think much of that narrative will fall apart, and it will go back to what this conflict really was at the outset. This is an intra-Yemeni fight. It's not clear to me exactly why this side is so much better for us or that side is so much better. What dog do we have in this fight, essentially? The Houthis were the main force against Al-Qaeda prior to the Saudis going in and starting that war. Mm-hmm. And that was part of the reason why a lot of folks in the US government were very much against what the Saudis were doing, even though the Obama administration essentially gave them a green light, which was the Houthis were fighting Al-Qaeda. And Al-Qaeda was actually the only entity in Yemen that had attacked America. Yes, the Houthis are saying death to America and they don't like the United States. The Houthis are not sponsoring terrorist attack against American soil. But Al-Qaeda has. They have killed more than 3,000 Americans. So it was clear that they should be deemed the real enemy there. But now we ended up taking a side against the main force against Al-Qaeda. I'm not saying the US should have been on the Houthi side or anything like that. I'm just saying perhaps we shouldn't be involved at all. And to the extent that we should be involved, perhaps we should try to use our diplomatic leverage to be able to bring about a peaceful solution. That to me would be true leadership. But leadership increasingly in Washington means, where do we bomb? That's not leadership. So the deeper question is, in what ways does it actually affect us if this or that side wins? I'm not saying that we should be indifferent, that there's human suffering and the civil war that is horrible, but that is actually what we're doing right now. Right now we're being indifferent because we are helping the Saudis continue a blockade that is killing more Yemenis than anything else right now.
Right.
So if we truly want to be helpful, we should recognize that perhaps this fight is not about us, and perhaps we shouldn't make it about us. And if there's anything positive we can do is to see if we can find ways to bring about an end to the warfare, rather than pouring arms in there, selling more weapons, taking sides, which invariably leads to longer suffering, longer warfare. And it's really unclear to me as to whether, from a US perspective, we're in a better situation in Yemen now than we were 5 years ago.
Okay, I will tell that to all my Trump supporting friends. Very well done. Now, speaking of Trump and alliances, you mentioned Russia. I mentioned Russia. Talk to me about the relationship between Iran and Russia and the relationship between Iran and China, because a lot of Americans will want to know that. Of course, that's going to be very important, right? If we find out that there's some kind of alliance that goes in, that actually involves planning, right? Planning to do things with those countries, that's going to raise all sorts of red flags for Americans, maybe rightly so. So tell me about Iranian-Russian relations. What's going on there?
Sure. In, I think it was 1995, then Iranian Foreign Minister Ali Akbar Velayati visited Moscow and said Russian-Iranian relations are now better than they have been in 500 years. That was a pretty accurate statement, because what it tells you is that Russian-Iranian relations for the last 500 years have been absolutely horrific.
Okay.
There's been several wars between Russia and Iran. You have, I think it was in 1822 or so, the Iranians actually sacked the Russian embassy, occupied Iran. They did so. The Soviets did so again after World War II. And many of these stans that we know now, from Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, large part of that was actually Iranian territory roughly 100, 130 years ago, which they lost in wars to the Russians. So there's always been a very, very suspicious relationship between the Iranians and the Russians. And what is really fascinating, if you compare it to the U.S. Iran relationship, there is immense, intense U.S. Iran enmity on a geopolitical and political level. But the United States has a lot of soft power in Iran. There's a lot of admiration for American culture, for the United States as a whole, as a people. So it's like a bizarre love-hate relationship. Iran and Russia is much more of a pure hate-hate relationship. There's not much of soft power in either direction. But both sides have been very pragmatic in pursuing their own interests. So they have collaborated when they can, and they've betrayed each other when they can and when they felt the need for it. So the Iranians certainly don't trust the Russians. The Russians certainly don't trust the Iranians. What is driving them together more than anything right now is the threat from the United States. For the Russians and for the Chinese, having a country like Iran that is independent and is not an ally of the United States in the Middle East is important. Otherwise, you would have essentially just states that are, to various degrees, client states of the United States. From a geopolitical perspective, neither the Chinese or the Russians want that. So they see Iran as the bulwark against the United States completely controlling the Middle East. And that's part of the reason why there's been a degree of support. But it also meant that there had been question marks as to whether the Russians really wanted a nuclear agreement between the United States and Iran. Because if it did pave the way for a broader rapprochement between the United States and Iran, how would that affect their interest? And the Chinese have had concerns. Now, what's happened in the last 5 years is not necessarily that the Iranians have moved much closer to the Russians, although they have less options because of the sanctions Trump imposed. The Iranians have moved closer to the Chinese, both economically and politically. And this is partly because this push for a Cold War with China and Washington, which have made the Chinese more interested in Iran. Earlier, the Iranians were hoping, begging that the Chinese would put in a veto on the Security Council against sanctions on Iran. The Chinese would be more protective of Iran. And they actually didn't end up being the case most of the time, because the Chinese had no interest in picking that type of a fight with the United States. Now, as the United States and the atmosphere in Washington has certainly very much moved towards some form of the Cold War with China, you can start seeing that the Chinese are being more aggressive in protecting the Iranians, not for the sake of the Iranians, but as part of their larger game with the United States. One thing that I thought was quite fascinating was that the Chinese, and I used to work in the Security Council, the Chinese were never particularly active in a Middle East conflict. They were so happy not being involved. They saw no value whatsoever for them to put any political or diplomatic capital into it. They made these, superficial statements calling for peace and things like that, but they never put any real skin into the game. But when you had the fighting between the Israelis and Hamas in Gaza, it was actually the Chinese that, together with New Zealand and Norway, put forward one of the resolutions that the US ended up preemptively vetoing, or essentially making sure it never got to a vote, that was calling for a ceasefire. And this was one of the few times I've seen them do so. And I think it's indicative of the fact that as the US is getting more aggressive towards China, the Chinese are going to be more aggressive against the United States throughout the world, perhaps more so in the Middle East and elsewhere, which I think will mean that the Chinese will do more things to protect or side with the Iranians in conflicts with the United States than they would have done 5-7 years ago. Whether that will lead to a full-scale alliance, etc., I doubt. I think because, A, the Iranians don't want to go that far. Even the 25-year agreement with China that was signed earlier last year, I'm feeling that this was actually jeopardizing what they desired to have, which is a non-aligned posture. On the Chinese side, yes, the Chinese may be pushing a little bit to anti-US measures by siding with Iran here and there. But at the end of the day, the Chinese don't want to take a side in the conflict between Iran and Saudi Arabia. They have no interest in that. They just want to make sure that they can buy oil from both sides, sell their products to both sides, and not be bothered by the conflict between the Iranians and the Saudis. So going all pro-Iran, I find extremely unlikely. But every once in a while, more so than before, siding with the Iranians in order to create problems for the US, to the extent that the US is pushing for a Cold War with China, or at least the Chinese perceive it as such, then I think that's going to be more of a likelihood than in the past.
So both alliances, the one with Russia and the one with China, were the result of, or reactions to, again, US foreign policy, correct? Is that what you're arguing?
I wouldn't say that it's entirely, but I would say this. For a very significant portion of the system, the elite, however much they were very suspicious of the United States, nevertheless, their preference, because of reality, not because of desires, was to move Iran a bit closer to the West, because the West provided technology, provided investment and financing, and provided the pathway towards Iran's political rehabilitation internationally. The Chinese and the Russians cannot legitimize Iran as a major power in the Middle East, but an acceptance by the West could do so. Over the course of the last 20 years, we've seen that to the extent that the Iranians increasingly believe that that option doesn't exist, and to the extent that the Iranians believe that, you know what, the Chinese actually are getting better and better technology. So the West's edge over China is shrinking. Clearly, it's still an edge, but it's shrinking. Vaccine diplomacy around COVID has been quite interesting to see some of the successes of both the Russian vaccine and the Chinese vaccine. So on the one hand, technology gap is shrinking. And secondly, when it comes to financing, that's one of the big changes that have happened in the last 10 years. China is fully capable now on financing quite a lot. So 2 out of the 3, actually, I would say 3 out of the 3 things that were clearly on the Western side that caused Iran to orient itself towards the West are starting to diminish. You don't have to be with the West to get technology. Again, it's inferior to Western technology, but the gap is shrinking. Financing on the Chinese side is a real option. Again, not as good or not as plentiful as with the West, but it's still an option. And 3, we're moving towards a multipolar world, clearly. We're deep in it, actually. And particularly mindful of how the Trump administration tried to destroy many of the international institutions, the idea that the United States has this unquestioned ability to decide who is inside the tent and who is outside the tent when it comes to international legitimacy is just no longer as clear cut as it was before. And it's going to become even less clear cut going forward. All of those things means that in the past, the Iranians were they were trying to gravitate towards the West, but when they got rejected, they had no choice but to go towards China and Russia. Today, it's not just getting rejected by the West. The Chinese actually have things to offer that the Iranians are attracted by. It does not mean that they will want to be squarely in China's orbit. But if the West is unwilling to make sure that they come to some sort of accommodation with Iran, and of course the Iranians have to be willing and flexible in that as well, then the Iranians have very little choice but to go in that direction. Again, this is where the JCPOA is so critical. Yeah. That was, at the end of the day, not just a nuclear agreement. It was a way for the West and Iran to resolve their tensions, put an end to 30 or so years of U.S. containment policy of Iran, and provide a path in which, when we saw more changes in Iranian policy in the region, for instance, there would also be changes in American policy vis-a-vis Iran. We never managed to get to that point because Trump pulled the rug under the JCPOA. So that proposition was never tested. So as you see now, more people in Iran feeling that they have to go to China, it's not because they think, the US is worse. It's because they don't think the US is open to it because of this experience.
Okay, the JCPOA, you've mentioned it a few times. First of all, what does it stand for? And what was it? What is it? And why is it so important? Everyone talks about it all the time. JCPOA of 2015.
JCPOA stands for Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which was an agreement between the United States, China, Russia, Germany, France, the UK, and Iran on how to, on a superficial level, although extremely important, of course, make sure that there was an agreement that prevented the Iranians from having any pathway towards a nuclear weapon, while enabling the Iranians to have a civilian nuclear energy program on their own soil, while also lifting sanctions and essentially bringing Iran back in. It was a very successful agreement up until Trump pulled out of it. Both sides were adhering to it fully. The Iranians continued to adhere to it fully for a full year. And then they started to reduce their obligations in a way that is highly problematic in response to the US pulling out and in response to the Europeans not being able to make sure that the Iranians were getting the economic benefits that they were promised. So on an immediate level, it's a non-proliferation agreement and a very successful one. But at a deeper level, it's many other things. It prevented the United States and Iran from gravitating towards war. Had this agreement not been struck, the United States and Iran would have continued and probably would have ended up with war. We saw that very clearly with Trump pulling out. He pulled out, and at least twice, the US and Iran were only minutes away from a full-scale war. And more examples in which they were not perhaps minutes away, but perhaps hours away. And we just saw another one here recently, in which after he lost the election, Trump was under a lot of pressure from Netanyahu, but also apparently from himself, in thinking that perhaps by starting a war with Iran in January, just 2 weeks before inauguration, he could change the dynamics in such a way that he could undo the election results or delay, whatever his plans were. We saw that from the book that is coming out with, based on interviews with Millie and others, in which there was this very, very significant fear that this is something that Trump would do. So it prevented that war. Two other things that I think are really important. It meant that we were now coming to terms with the fact, a reality many people in Washington may not like, but it is a reality. Iran is a major power in the region. And if you want to have a successful policy in the Middle East, seeking to contain and isolate Iran, does not change its policies. We know that after 40 years. B, only make matters worse. So you have to bring in the country, and then through that process, try to find ways to change some of the policies that are problematic. That's what the JCPOA did. The JCPOA was brilliant and durable for a very obvious reason. Both sides had to give something to get something. So both sides would lose something if they left the agreement. The US had to give sanctions relief, had to accept that Iran is a major player. The Iranians have to give full transparency to their nuclear program, ship out 98% of their low enriched uranium, install cameras in every element of Iran's nuclear program that would make sure that they could never go towards nuclear weapons. Both sides had to give to get. And that process could have been continued, and Iran could have been rehabilitated. And the reason why that is so important is for the second factor. In some ways, the JCPOA was the exit ticket for the United States to be able to leave the Middle East. If we believe that the Middle East no longer is that critical, and we need to make sure that we don't have 19 bases there, and we don't have generations of Americans fighting in endless wars over there, the one risk that could bring the United States back into another land war in the Middle East was Iran's nuclear program and the policy of containing Iran.
Wow.
If we could resolve that, then it paves the way for us to be able to do a fuller withdrawal. I can tell you right now, plans of a broader military withdrawal from the Middle East, it is very much contingent upon whether negotiations in Vienna are successful, meaning the negotiations to rejoin the JCPOA. Because if we don't have a JCPOA and we're going to have further escalation of tensions with Iran, then no, you're not going to see more US troops leaving the region. You may actually see the opposite. In my view, I think perhaps the Obama administration in their selling job could have done things a little bit differently. I think it was very clear. They decided a strategy in which they wanted to sell the JCPOA solely on its non-proliferation merits, because those merits were so overwhelmingly clear and strong and not speculative. We had, mechanisms to oversee everything the Iranians were doing. Talking about it from a geopolitical standpoint, I think is very strong, but it would introduce elements of risk and speculation, because we can't control all of those variables, but we really could control most of the variables on the nuclear program. But I think with that choice, there was a very critical element that was lost, is that the American public didn't really understand the role the JCPOA played for the broader issue of ending the endless wars.
Okay, that's all well and good. I hope you're right. But I don't know if you answered this. Are they building nuclear weapons, Trita Parsi?
No, they're not building nuclear weapons, very much thanks to the JCPOA, but also according to Israeli, European, and US intelligence services, there's not been any efforts to build nuclear weapons in Iran since 2003. However, what they were doing were putting into place the infrastructure that could be used for building a nuclear weapon. But the political decision to build a nuclear weapon had not been taken.
Okay.
And this is part of the reason why it was important to do this, because if you want to do it, you got to do it before they build a nuclear weapon. Otherwise, you're in this situation with North Korea, right? They have a nuclear weapon, and the likelihood that they will give it up is extremely limited.
Okay.
So you had to stop somewhere so that they didn't just have the political decision, they didn't have the capacity to be able to build it.
Well, okay. So if that's true, then why is it that Iranian nuclear scientists keep getting killed in the streets?
Well, part of the reason for that is because from the Israeli perspective, or at least from the perspective of the Netanyahu government, the issue was actually never nuclear weapons per se. The broader issue was the geopolitics of it. If the Israelis really were worried that the Iranians were building a nuclear weapon, everything they've been doing has been completely counterproductive. It's not been working at all, and they know it. Their biggest fear, and I can say this with some degree of authority, I was part of track 2 conversations that were more like track 1 conversations, track 1.5. There was one meeting in particular in April 2012. A very interesting gathering. In the room, you had 5 Israelis, including one very, very senior Israeli, others who were very high ranking in the military. You had, I think, 3 or 4 Iranians, including 2 former nuclear negotiators and 1 active person within the foreign industry. And there were several Americans and others there. And at one point, this very senior Israeli said something that was really stunning. He said, this was never about enrichment, essentially, nuclear weapons.
Mm-hmm.
And, people were kind of stunned because for like 10, 15 years, we've been hearing that enrichment in Iran is an existential threat to Israel. What Israel needs from Iran is what he called a sweeping attitude change. And then he went on to explain what that is. He said, Israel will never accept Iran becoming friends with the United States, or actually he said, will never accept the United States becoming friends with Iran without Iran becoming friends with Israel. So let's unpack what that meant. And he explained it further in one of the. If the United States and Iran were to sign a nuclear agreement, and that issue would be gone, would be neutralized, what would that mean? It would mean that the United States and Iran would not become best friends. But the key issue that was pushing them towards war would be gone. And the United States would have the ability to shift its focus elsewhere. Because the United States is a global power and it has responsibilities and interests throughout the globe. Why all the focus on the Middle East when it's no longer, tensions would decrease? But then the question is, would there be a proportionate reduction in Iranian-Israeli tension? The Israeli answer was most likely not, which then means that Israel, in their view, would be abandoned to face Iran and its hostility on its own without the automatic and full backing of the United States.
Oh, wow.
And he made it very clear, we will not allow the United States to become friends with Iran without Iran becoming friends with Israel. I'm not saying that the nuclear issue is a complete pretext. There's definitely elements in Israel that are very worried, but the Iranians getting a nuclear weapon. But there's a political dimension here that went beyond whether the Iranians get a nuclear. It's about the geopolitical changes in the region and the fact that keeping hostility between the United States and Iran alive keeps the United States in the region. And when the United States is in the region, it means that its big military finger is on the scale in favor of a balance in the region that is enjoyable and fruitful for the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Israelis, and others aligned with the United States. Whether this is good for the United States or not is a different story. And to a certain extent, I respect the fact that the Israelis have a very clear idea of their own interest. It may be wrongly defined, in my view it is, but nevertheless, they're not confusing it. They're not saying we have to do what our allies think are good, right? They're pursuing their own interests. The Iranians are pursuing their own interests. The Russians are pursuing their own interests. We have a definition of our interest that is so, again, confused and broad and limitless that we end up putting ourselves in really, really precarious situations.
Fascinating. The Israeli piece of that is really interesting. I'd never thought about that they would be left alone, essentially, if the United States signed such an agreement to make themselves effectively non-actors in the region. That's really interesting. I'm going to ponder that. So I have you for 5 more minutes. We have to talk about history, deeper history. So Madeleine Albright, you may have heard of her. She once said that the coup of Mossadegh in 1953 in Iran by the CIA-led coup, Operation Ajax, it was called, that deposed the leader of Iran and replaced him with the Shah, essentially. She called that, Trita, remarkably short-sighted by the United States. That's how she described it. How do you think about 1953? And how should we think about 1953?
I would end up in agreement with Madeleine Albright. It probably doesn't happen too often, but on this one, yes. It was immensely short-sighted. And I think, again, what happens here is that when we were in a Cold War frame, you could justify almost anything on the US side. In fact, this is what happened. The Brits had been pushing the United States to take action against Mossadegh because Mossadegh was doing the unspeakable thing of seeking to make sure that the Iranians would keep 50% of the oil that they owned. The Brits were essentially pumping Iranian oil and keeping all the revenues for themselves. And they offered Iran 10% or 12%. Mossadegh had the audacity of asking for 50%. And he was challenging essentially the manner in which the British were just sucking Iran's wealth out of it.
Mm-hmm.
But the US side was not particularly interested at first. It's not until the British discovered a different argument. It's not that they could go and say Mossadegh is a communist, because very clear, Mossadegh was quite hostile to the Soviets and did not want to fall into their orbit. The argument was he can become a communist.
Yeah.
So because he could become a communist, we now had to take action.
Mm-hmm.
And once you put it in the Cold War frame,
right,
it suddenly changed the calculations on the American side. And the United States did this coup. It was in the short term seen as a tremendous success. It cost no more than $10,000. Massive manipulation of another country's politics. But the long-term effect is really difficult to underestimate. Up until that point, the United States was actually seen as, correctly, oftentimes on the side of third world countries seeking independence, itself having once fought a war of independence from the British. This changed everything. This is the moment where the United States loses its innocence in Iran. And it ended up being the key factor as to why the Shah reigned for another 25 years. Those last 25 years were the most brutal of his reign.
Mm-hmm.
And why, in the Iranian vocabulary, oftentimes the Shah was referred to as the American Shah. And then we saw the anti-American sentiments of the revolution. And here we are with everything that has been going on. The long-term effects of even a highly successful coup, the blowback of it, is paid for by future generations of Americans and whatever country we have here. And I think it really should be a cautionary tale in general. The United States itself is extremely unforgiving, even when the interference of another country in our political system is simply through Facebook, right? Let's set aside as to whether there was more or less, but we see how important that is as a theme that generates a lot of sentiments. There's no reason to believe that other countries would be any less sensitive and any less unforgiving of that type of interference.
Right.
And in this case, we're talking about someone who, as much as he was quite valuable to the United States in the context of the Cold War, nevertheless was also a very brutal dictator, and who, again, the United States is seen as responsible for many of the sins that the Shah committed. So, it's really hard to see any examples of the United States interfering, manipulating other countries' politics, how that, if you just take a look at it from a utilitarian perspective, is it really useful and helpful in the long run? Forget about the moral dimension of which, I mean, there's no discussion to be had there whatsoever.
Right.
But it's fascinating how oftentimes, because of frames that we tend to obsess over, we find ways to justify things that perhaps under other contexts would not have been acceptable. We know that the United States was rejecting British pushes to do something earlier on, up until that Cold War frame was being used. And then we see now also how we did a lot of things in the Middle East that really do not serve our interests, do not serve the interest of the region in terms of stability, but because of Iran, they were justified. And you can see that in Iran as well. I mean, this is not an American phenomenon in itself. In Israel right now, you can justify almost anything by throwing out either Syria or Iran into the conversation. Right. In Iran, you can do the same thing by throwing in the United States or Israel. Once a couple of entities decide that they're going to obsess over each other, they can end up doing a tremendous amount of damage to themselves. And that's what I think we did with 1953 and many, many of the other interventions.
Fabulous capsules history of that. Fun fact, and then I will let you go, that almost no one knows, is that American and British oil companies in the 1950s were consistently opposed to military interventions in Iran because they understood that it would end all business as usual, right? But people don't know that. And that's for another time. We'll talk about that later, hopefully. So I recommend to everyone listening, to go to the Quincy Institute website, find Trita's page there, and you will see it's a really well done website. You'll see, I think it's all of your articles, all your videos, all your recent media appearances right there. It's very easy to scan through. Where else should they go to
ones from my Quincy years? If you want to go older stuff, you can just go to tritaparsi.com, and all of the other stuff is there as well, the pre-Quincy stuff.
Fantastic. Trita, thank you so much for this. This has just been a treat. And
thank you so much for having me. This was a great conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Great. I'm so glad. Thank you so much, and be well.
You too. Talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
This is the Unregistered podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. To join the new Renegade University, go to renegadeuniversity.com. To join the new Unregistered Underground, the supporting listeners group for the podcast, go to unregisteredunderground.com. Thanks for listening.